One of the most fascinating moments was where somehow one of the students wound up revealing that they were saying that they were a Zionist, and another said that they were an anti-Zionist. And they said, well, what do those terms mean? And some of the students who said that they were Zionist, once they explained what they meant, recognized that they had more in common with people who said that they were anti-Zionist than with some of the other people who said that they were Zionist. The terms have been emptied of meaning.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways people's lives have changed since the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking to people around the world to learn how this profound moment in Jewish and global history continues to shift, shape, and change them. To learn more, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. Hi, I'm Manya Marcus, and this is being recorded on November 9th, 2025. You're about to hear a conversation I recorded back in September with Dr. Devin Naar, a professor of Sephardic Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Recording this interview was difficult for me. I've envisioned this podcast as a way to chronicle history in real time, to capture through long-form conversations the vastness and intensity of the post-October 7th landscape for Jews around the world and for many others as well. Until now, the voices I've centered have largely been those of self-described Zionists, people who, in the wake of an indescribably cruel and harrowing attack on Israel, have faced a wave of vitriol, intolerance, hostility, and even violence. But if this project is truly to document this moment in all its complexities, it has to include non-Zionist voices, and we need to recognize explicitly that there is no single Jewish community, but, as has always been the case, Jewish communities. The word Israel in Hebrew, Yisrael, means to wrestle. We usually think about this in reference to wrestling with God, but the truth is, we wrestle one another also. I'm not interested in speaking with anyone who uses a non- or anti-Zionist stance as a rejection of dialogue, as a reason to hurl slogans, to deny the humanity or intelligence of people who are Zionists, or to justify acts of terror. But as we all navigate what I hope is a post-war reality, I believe that staying engaged, especially with those we perceive as the other, is a skill that those of us who live in a multiplicity of Jewish communities will need to cultivate for our civility, for our integrity, and in some ways, for our survival. We've chosen to present this interview in two parts, exactly as it unfolded. At the end of this first installation, you'll hear, as I did, that Devin seems unsettled, that there's more he wants to say. After wrapping up, we turn the microphones back on and continue the conversation, which you'll hear in part two. This interview may be challenging to listen to, just it was challenging for me to record. But I hope you'll stay with it and imagine what it might be like to have a similar conversation with someone, maybe someone close to you, who has provoked in you a sense of discomfort or distress, or even betrayal over these past long 2 years. Okay. It is September 9th, 2025. I am here with Professor Devin Naar. Devin, why don't you tell me where we are and what it is you do here and why it smells like this?
So we are in my office at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I'm a professor of history and chair of the Sephardic Studies program here. And why does my office smell like this is because it is full of books, mostly published in the Ottoman Empire in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. So my office is an office, but it is also a historical archive / storage facility for some of the treasures that have been in the custodianship of members of the local Sephardic community here.
So I'm going to ask you a question, which is, do you remember what your initial reaction was when our producer reached out and said that we would love to schedule an interview with you? You had a reaction I'd love for you to share.
I took a look at, your web materials and everything, and I think the perspective that I would probably offer, my sense was it might be a little bit different from some of the other conversations that you've been having. Maybe a little more critical, maybe a little bit further out of the field.
So when you said that, a conversation with you might be more critical. I said to our producer, of what? Of me as an interviewer, of the state of Israel, of, what is he talking about? And this is when I started to do a deeper dive. I'm connecting this question to my observation about the smell in here.
Okay.
Because you shared with me just a moment ago that some of the treasures you have over here have been garnered through connections that you've made in the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community in Seattle, which I hear is one of the largest in the country, if not the world.
One of the largest, yes.
One of the largest. Yes. It brings us right to the center of part of this discussion, which is that your work itself relies on relationships that you have built with the community here, but probably not just your work. Can you speak about this community, how long you've been here, what the relationships have been like, and what any of the recent challenges may have been?
I'm of both Sephardic and Ashkenazi heritage myself. My father's family is Sephardic, and my sort of Jewish universe was largely structured through interactions with my extended Sephardic family. My grandfather was born in Salonika, which was part of the Ottoman Empire for 4 centuries. Today is the second largest city in Greece and had 50% of the population was Jewish, Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. So I grew up immersed in a community that was kind of a remnant of the community of Salonika, and that sort of sparked my interest historically. There were not many other people I knew whose families were Jewish, but who, like in my case, my great-grandfather was a rabbi, but he wore a fez. And he lived in Turkey, but didn't speak Turkish. He spoke a language that was described as Spanish, but they wrote it in Hebrew letters. And my grandfather went to a French school, but I called him by the Italian word, which is all the Ladino word for grandfather, which is no. So all sorts of questions emerged for me about how are all of these different things possible, constituting one single identity. And in order for me to try to process that and figure out, well, I began to study.
Can I pause you for a second? Did you grow up speaking Ladino in the home?
I grew up hearing Ladino from my grandfather and his brothers and sisters. And no one spoke to me in Ladino. I would say that I had acquired food words, greeting words, and let's say defense words.
Can you define that latter category?
Curse words, I would say. You got to be able to say something back if, just in case, which are also heavily Turkish inflected, by the way, many of the curse words in Ladino, because it is a language that is based in Spanish, but after the Jews were expelled from Spain, many of them settled in the Ottoman Empire, and over the generations, the language incorporated a lot of influence from the surrounding cultural environment. So not only Turkish, but also Greek, Arabic, and then broader Mediterranean influences, Italian, hence nono and nonna, French, and other things like that. So it's only really when I went to college and I became interested in trying to understand more about my identity, where my family came from, why the story that I understood to be a normal Jewish story was completely unknown, in fact, incomprehensible to other Jewish kids that I met in college who were like, Naar, what kind of name is that? That's not a Jewish name. Jews in Greece, that's not real. There are no Jews in Greece. That, I think, added an additional element for me to try to understand this world. And so coming to Seattle, in a certain sense, was really kismet in terms of a perfect match for me after I completed my dissertation. I mean, I'm skipping ahead to how we got here to Seattle, but when I arrived in Seattle, I received such a warm welcome and embrace from members of the local Sephardic community.
How long ago was that at this
14
point?
years.
14
years.
years.
It was now 14 years ago that I arrived here. And when I arrived, and people recognized my background and they recognized my proficiency in Ladino, because by this time I had been studying it for many, many years. And in college, I began to ask my grandfather, to speak to me in Ladino because I really wanted to understand it. So we spoke in Ladino, but his Ladino was a little rusty by then. And so we were sort of speaking what we call Ladinglish. So it was Ladino and a little English.
Sorry, I've never heard that before. It's quite amusing.
I think I may have made it up, but you get the analogy, right?
Sure.
So it was really an ongoing process of acquiring the language. I lived in Greece, in his city in Salonika, and before I knew Greek, I was speaking to the elders in Ladino. So I developed an ability to speak not only Ladino, but specifically the Salonican dialect. The old timers, they could identify when I spoke. They said, oh, you're from Salonika because I said X, Y, or Z. I said, well, I'm not exactly from Salonika, but it's a couple generations removed. People started to bring me documents. This is what you're smelling here. the books, even the people who had grown up hearing Ladino, these are people who are now largely deceased, or maybe they're 80 years or older. They didn't necessarily learn how to read and write it, and certainly not in Hebrew characters. And that's what all the literature that we have, all the texts are almost exclusively written in Ladino in Hebrew characters, which is just like Yiddish written in Hebrew characters. And so they would come to me with these texts and ask me to decipher them. And I remember one of the first documents that came to my attention, an older man whose parents were from the island of Rhodes. He's now deceased. He was in his 90s when I first arrived. And the only thing he could understand from the document was the date, 1942, and it said the place, Seattle. And he said, "What does this document say?" And it's written in the now defunct Sephardic cursive style of Hebrew. It's known as solitreo. So like when you learn Hebrew today, you actually learn Ashkenazic script. There was a whole different system of writing the Hebrew characters. Sephardic script was completely normal for Jews from the Ottoman Empire to write like this. And this was the style in which this letter was written. And I start to read this document. The gentleman becomes emotional. He starts to cry a little. It was his grandfather's last will and testament. And he understood enough Ladino to understand perfectly well what I was saying as I read that document, but he had never learned how to read or write. And he said to me, "I've been waiting 70 years for you to come here to bring me my grandfather's voice." That was very profound for me. And then I became very interested. Well, what else might be here in the community? What other treasures might be there? And so that's what led me to go into the community and to request, do you have books? Do you have documents? Bring them forward. Let's see what they are. And that's how we developed what has become one of the largest collections of Ladino archival materials in the country. We have more Ladino books at the University of Washington than are at the Library of Congress or at Harvard University. And it's all from individual families, basements, closets, bookshelves, under the bed. People store things in interesting places.
I'm sure they find things in
and they
strange
find
places
things
all
in
the time.
interesting places too. So that became the basis of a really dynamic collaboration and cooperation between the local community and the university, bridging town and gown, as they say. And we developed a very robust Sephardic Studies program here at the University of Washington.
Were there other kind of relationships that were developed here? I mean, I'm imagining you and I are about the same age.
Right,
is that
that's
right?
right,
So
yeah.
you're coming, I'm assuming you had not yet had children.
That's correct, yes.
You are in your early 30s, late 20s, right? And you're speaking to somebody who says, and this I assume is emblematic of other sentiments that you hear, I've been waiting for you.
Right,
I've been waiting generations for you.
Yeah.
I'm imagining that it feels like a kinship.
Oh, yeah.
And when there's kinship and community, there's also pressure.
Right. We received regular invitations for Shabbat meals, for Yamim Noraim, to go here, go there. It was just such a warm embrace, but also a recognition of certain kind of limits, I would say, because the Sephardic Kehilot are Sephardic, but they are Orthodox style. So I think this became essentially a non-starter for me and my spouse in terms of separate seating for men and women and women's non-participation in the tefillah and
Okay, so for those who don't know, Kehilot is community, religious community, and Tefillot is this prayer service.
Right, the prayer service. And so it became such that I think, there was an expectation. Would we move? Would we live near the congregations? Would we become members? That didn't materialize in that way for the reasons that I just described. And also there are a variety of other reasons that made that not work out initially. But I think those connections retained. I mean, really strong friendships that developed and were enhanced, especially around the times of holidays. We didn't know anybody. I knew one friend from college. I didn't know anybody else. It was so much fun to be invited, especially in a place like Seattle where they say, there's the Seattle freeze and, and I would say,
I have heard this.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that means?
Well, the stereotype is, that there's a strong kind of Northern European and a Nordic kind of culture. This is the stereotype. Maybe it's a little bit racist actually or something, but that presents a little kind of a cold kind of dynamic. People maybe aren't as friendly or warm or welcoming. We certainly experienced that in a variety of different domains of our life, but when it came to this particular dynamic, the relationships were very warm and very friendly. We could always have a Shabbat meal or have somewhere to go for Yamim Noraim, for the high holidays.
But if only by not moving into the communities that you might have been expected to move into
Yeah.
or joining the congregations that they might have
Yeah.
hoped that you would,
Yeah.
you were establishing a little bit of a difference,
Right.
right? Between you and the community or you and the expectation of who you would
Right.
be.
Right.
I want to propel us a little bit further, not to October 7th right
Yeah.
away,
Yeah.
but to what I understand to have been a kind of painful experience in May of 2021.
Right.
Can you share a little bit about what happened there and what the fallout was from that situation?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people experience tension or break with community after October 7th. And for me, in a certain way, that already happened in 2021 during the previous conflict between Israel and Hamas, however we want to characterize it,
Sure.
at the time in the spring of 2021. And I signed a statement that was critical of Israel's military response at that time, along with a few hundred other scholars of Jewish studies. This became an explosive act insofar as a small but vocal, we could say right-wing, very strong pro-Israel segment within the organized Sephardic community became absolutely enraged by my decision to sign that statement. It provoked a kind of crisis along multiple fronts, I would say. For me, at the personal level, it was really a sad moment for me. I was getting criticized by people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I had sat next to in the synagogue, for example, calling me a traitor, a self-hating Jew, telling me that I'm promoting anti-Semitism, bringing harm to their community. Go back to fucking New Jersey, which was
Oh, goodness.
a good one, or somebody called me Adonme, which I thought was one of the most fascinating and culturally specific insults. I don't know if you're familiar
I do not
with
know what that means.
Adonme. You know Shabbatai Tzvi?
Yeah.
You remember Shabbatai
Oh,
Tzvi?
yeah.
So Shabbatai Tzvi was 17th century figure who purported to be the Messiah. He was in the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And under pressure from the Sultan, he converted to Islam.
Yes.
And his followers, some of whom converted to Islam also, got the name Dönme, which is Turkish. It means kind of turncoat, essentially.
Wow.
I was like, ooh, extra credit for that insult, though, because that's very culturally specific.
Wow.
I don't mean to downplay it. Like, I was under a barrage of attacks, folks trying to lobby me to remove my name from the statement. And that was not something that I was willing to do. And I had many conversations with members of the community to try to explain how I arrived at my position. And I think in a certain sense that made it worse. I think some folks thought that maybe I had made a mistake, that I had been peer pressured into it. Somebody asked me if I was on drugs,
Oh, wow.
What that reflected was a real sense that they wanted to see me as a representative of them. I made no such representations myself. I signed it as me as an individual person.
Did you sign it on behalf of the university?
I did not. No, I did not. It was specifically set up. University affiliations were included for identification purposes only, but I
Okay.
didn't do it in my specific capacity as an employee of the university or as the chair of the Sephardic Studies program.
Let me pause you there for a second because I've wondered about this. Was the blowback harsher from within the Sephardic community, the townies, than it was from your colleagues? I'm guessing you had some colleagues who agreed with your position and some who really did not.
I would say at that time, my primary orientation was toward the community response. I mean, maybe a couple of colleagues were upset or maybe said some harsh words to me about it, but the kind of a campaign of denunciation that came my direction was really from this, I would say again, small but very vocal segment of the community, so much so that one of the congregations that I had participated in, but again, I did not belong there, passed a resolution essentially banning me from the congregation, ostensibly in my professional capacity.
Meaning you weren't to lecture there.
I wasn't to lecture there, but like an excommunication, essentially.
Right.
I was cut off from the community. And what that did also was it split the community between the Naristas and the anti-Naristas, my supporters and those who were against me. And I think as much as I was experiencing my own kind of grief, the congregation was going through its own kind of crisis because it now was split into these two competing factions that ultimately had consequences for the well-being of the congregation in a certain sense. So this is May. This continues until Yamim Noraim, until the high holidays.
So September, October.
Yeah, and there is another board meeting that is convened, and eventually my supporters prevail and they overturn the edict against me, and that creates some more turmoil in the congregation. And then there's a final follow-up during Sukkot, where I have a meeting with some other community leaders, in which one of the main leaders, we kind of agreed that we were going to disagree, and that this figure, a very respected figure in the community, wanted to ensure that there was as much distance as possible between that statement that I'd signed and this person's position. He wanted to make that clear. At the same time, wanting to make clear that we still had something in common, which was our shared interest in preserving and promoting and studying Sephardic history and culture. So that provided us with a path forward. And so in the end of the day, people think, well, did you lose all your supporters for Sephardic studies? No. In fact, in the end, we didn't lose any supporters of our main supporters for Sephardic studies. But what also transpired was that my colleague who held the chair of Israel studies here, this now created a much more public kind of dynamic that emerged that resulted in the university returning the endowment for Israel studies. And that became a national news story. My own kind of struggle and verbal conflict with the local community remained local, and it remained within the Sephardic community. And I think this is actually the first time I'm speaking about it, in some kind of public space.
I want to ask you this. I mean, it's very clear to me why this would be a moment of grief for you. When you think about it now, when you think about it post-October 7th, do you have any more sympathy for the people who felt so stung by you, so wounded, and were so abrasive, I think, in the way that they reacted?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were trying to protect their community, and I understand that.
Did you understand that at the time?
What I didn't understand was the extent to which I was perceived as their representative in the public, and that what I did was perceived to reflect on them, that I was somehow their ambassador, as if I were a rabbi or an elected official or something like that. The other thing that I didn't know but learned was how many people were sympathetic to the position that I had, but would never have dared to say it in public. So that was something that also came out for me at that time that I found very fascinating, even including people in that community who felt like the statement I signed did not go far enough. So that was really, really fascinating. And I think the other thing that it led me to recognize was the extent to which, among my detractors, they were not reading what I had been writing until that time. And
meaning it would not have been such a departure.
Right. Like, it's one thing if we're talking about borekas or Sephardic food or canticas, Sephardic song, or even we're talking about Ladino culture. But if you're reading my scholarship in other public fora, like magazines like Jewish Currents, which has a left-leaning tilt, the statement that I have signed would have not been in any way surprising.
I want to stop there for a second, because I said to myself, I want to find somebody to talk to in Seattle who can speak to this commentary that has emerged about Israel as being a space of whiteness. And I thought, if I can find somebody who knows the Sephardic community, is of the Sephardic community, I mean, it's bonus points for speaking Ladino, then simply you will dismantle this notion that Jews are white. We're going to have a very nice conversation. We're going to agree with each other, right? I mean, it's sort of funny, because I know now, having done this for a while, that I should never assume what awaits me. When you say, I didn't understand the extent to which I was this representative, you are ripe for projection. Even for me, I'm owning that. Your ripeness for projection has to do with being ethnically ambiguous. It has to do, to some extent, with being, I think, a little bit politically ambiguous, though I guess it depends on what background you're up against. What do you want to say about this canvas that you are to members of the Jewish and non-Jewish community right now?
Going back to the 2021 moment, for example, one of the other fascinating things that happened was I got a lot of phone calls. Some people wanted to meet with me, and I would meet with them because I wanted to engage. I didn't want to close off. Anybody that wanted to talk to me, I had many, many, many conversations, individual conversations on Zoom with groups of leaders. I'll never forget one conversation I had with somebody who I knew. I had been to their home for the high holidays meal and came very aggressively on the phone yelling at me. I explained a little bit my position. I explained a little bit about the history of Sephardic Jews and the orientation of Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire toward Zionism and toward Israel and Palestine and the region. And he said two things that I'll never forget. One was on this conversation and one was the next day. This conversation, he said, Devin, I thought I was calling you to school you, but I have to admit, I got schooled. I didn't know really anything about Sephardic Jews and Zionism. It was not part of my education. I knew about Yehuda Halevi and the medieval Spanish poetry longing for Zion, but I didn't know about the realia of the political life of my own great-grandparents, my own grandparents in the Ottoman Empire and what it might have been like for them in the context of the emergence of Zionism. And then he called me the next day to apologize to me for shouting at me. I think that took a lot of courage on his part. And I came to understand that why he was so enraged was because his children were saying things like I was saying. And he wasn't going to shout at them like that. So I became the screen. He could fling it all on me. He could expiate it all. And unlike the other people who did that, he regained his composure and he called me back and he apologized. That was very meaningful. I got another message, and I actually brought this here. Another friend of mine, these are people who are like, in 2021, they're like in their 60s, let's say, whose children are younger than us a little bit. This was in a discussion over whether to continue to support my work. He hemmed and hawed. We had long conversations over the phone, emotional. These are friends. These are existential matters that we're dealing with. And he wrote to me, I've been torn between what is a real friendship between us on the one hand and an ideological disagreement on the other. Talking with you has been so helpful in reconciling those two formidable forces. At the end of the day, the friendship and brotherhood that exists between us is a very high bar for any ideological or political disagreement to clear. The friendship and brotherhood remains the highest value. And that was very reaffirming and reassuring for me. And while many people did not make that same statement, I felt that from others, whereas I felt the impossibility of that from yet others. We raised our voices at each other over the phone, prior to this email. And I mean, my spouse says, who are you talking to? Why were you shouting like that? We were shouting at each other, but in the way that in this instance, we had this strong friendship. We're of different generations. I'm East Coast, he's West Coast. I mean, so many differences about us, but we still had that shared ability to come together as friends and a shared sense like we still are part of this community, whether we like it or not.
Did anybody say to you, because this is what we hear in Europe, this is what we hear in some of the other interviews that we've done this trip for this season, that the place for condemnation of what's happening in Israel, the place for concern, for criticism, is internal to the Jewish community. You just said that you were dealing with existential matters, referring to what happened in May of 2021. Everything about Israel, to me, as a visible Jew in the diaspora, feels more and more existential. The stakes feel higher and higher. Did anybody say to you then, I agree with you, but this can't come to the public because the audience creates the problem? Was there any sentiment like that?
Absolutely. Both people who agreed with me and disagreed with me would share similar sentiments. Like, I agree with what you're saying, but keep that entre nosotros, among us. If you say it out loud to the public, that can then be harnessed by those who are against us, let's say. And even those who said that they were against me said similar things. I can respect your opinion, but you cannot make that a public opinion.
Do you have any sympathy for that argument now? Has it changed for you since October 7th?
I would say it has, but I think I would need to explain
Please.
a little bit about October 7th first before I get to that point.
Let's talk about October 7th. Let's talk about the day. Let's talk about its impact. Let's talk about your relationship to it.
The thing that hit me hardest about October 7th was that one of my former students, colleague, friend, was murdered on October 7th. So that made October 7th unlike the 2021 thing for a zillion different reasons. But the immediacy of knowing someone who was murdered, and that was my former teaching assistant, my former research assistant, Chaim Katzman, who was a PhD student here at the University of Washington and had just completed his dissertation on religious Zionism. He came out of that background and he became a peace activist and really a leftist. And that's why he was in the Gaza envelope. He was in Holit there. And he was a really brilliant and fascinating thinker because of the different kinds of contexts in which he had traveled and out of which he had emerged, from religious Zionism to kind of a left-wing, almost anti-Zionist kind of perspective, that he had certainly a harsh, critical perspective. You know, he dedicated his dissertation to all life forms between the river and the sea. And he was really thinking creatively about what a future in Israel, Palestine could look like, should look like, that would respect the rights of all and also would recognize the reality that there are not just individual people there. This is one of the challenges that people who advocate for a one-state solution with equal rights for everybody, there are peoples that have their discrete histories and their identities and their languages and their cultures. So he was immersed in a kind of project of imagining what a future could look like that would respect both individual and I think also kind of a collective understanding. The other thing about Chaim that really struck me is that he changed how I taught about the Holocaust. I have taught our Holocaust course here at the University of Washington, I mean, since my arrival. I can't teach it every year. It's too emotionally overwhelming. He was my TA for that course. I like to have my TAs give a guest lecture if they'd like on a topic related to the course. And he gave a talk about the Holocaust and the memory of the Shoah in Israeli society. He brought several passages of thinkers about how to conceptualize the relationship between Israel and the Holocaust. And he brought a passage that now I use this in my teaching of the Holocaust by the Polish Jewish thinker Isaiah Deutscher. And he gives an allegory. A man once jumped from the top floor of a burning house in which many members of his family had already perished. He managed to save his life, but as he was falling, he hit a person standing down below and broke that person's legs and arms. The jumping man had no choice. Yet to the man with the broken limbs, he was the cause of his misfortune. If both behaved rationally, they would not become enemies. The man who escaped from the blazing house, having recovered, would have tried to help and console the other sufferer, and the latter might have realized that he was the victim of circumstances over which neither of them had control. But look what happens when these people behave irrationally. The injured man blames the other for his misery and swears to make him pay for it. The other, afraid of the crippled man's revenge, insults him, kicks him, and beats him whenever they meet. The kicked man again swears revenge and is again punched and punished. The bitter enmity, so fortuitous at first, hardens and comes to overshadow the whole existence of both men and to poison their minds.
Okay, so when I hear that, my understanding is that he's referring to Jews who were persecuted during the Holocaust, jumping out of the window into the state of Israel in 1948. And the Nakba, essentially, or this whole entire sort of, devastating experience of Palestinian Arabs. It's the same moment that he's describing. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes, that's correct. That's how
I'm surprised in some ways that you didn't teach it that way to begin with, based on what you're sharing about your scholarship. What was new about this for you? What did Chaim introduce to you that was different?
I think it gave in the allegory here a compressed way of explaining historical dynamics.
Okay.
It enabled me to, in a concise manner, sort of encapsulate a particular way of conceptualizing the relationship between the Holocaust and the Nakba and the ongoing kind of conflict that continues.
And he brought that.
He brought this.
He brought this to the lecture.
He brought this to the lecture.
Oh, wow.
And it really struck me. And I think it struck the student because it encapsulated this dynamic in a way. And there's plenty to critique about this too, by the way, in terms of agency, in terms of, were Jews just fleeing a fire, and were there not ulterior motives? I mean, was the Nakba really just an accident? And so this becomes then a point of discussion for my students, and we contextualize it with other kinds of readings. But I think it is a good entree into trying to delve into the subject matter. And so Chaim was murdered on October 7th. At first, they thought he was kidnapped, but he was murdered defending his neighbor and her children in a closet. Imagining that kind of a scenario, it was devastating.
Can you say something more about that in the sense that, you knew him as this budding, brilliant scholar. Was it difficult for you to imagine him dying in this way? Was that surprising to you?
In a certain sense, it was fitting with his character. I would say that he would have been in a protective role.
Yeah.
That part doesn't surprise me, but just the whole scenario was so startling. I mean, to fathom that, it's still difficult. We're up to almost 2 years. It's difficult for me to still wrap my mind around that.
How did you find out?
I think his mother had posted on social media about it. So I've subsequently been in touch with his mother, who I hadn't known, before, and through some colleagues, some mutual colleagues who were his professors.
Well, something that you shared with me when we talked prior to the interview is that you thought a lot about what Chaim would have thought about what has transpired since. Is there anything you want to share about that?
What I know of him as a person, of his politics, of his scholarship, I think he would have been on the front lines of the Not in Our Name movement. He's been described in the press as a peace activist, which I think he was, but he was an anti-occupation activist also, and he was on the left. The position that he would have taken here would have been in opposition, essentially, to the strident response that Israel engendered after October 7th. And so I think about that. I mean, I do think, what would Chaim think? I mean, that is a question that pops into my head occasionally.
I want to ask you this, if it's okay. When you think about what would Chaim think, do you think about what the Chaim that you knew would think, or do you think about Chaim plus witness to violence, what that combination would think? Because I can imagine what you're saying based on who you're describing having known, but do you imagine the impact that this event would have had on his mentality?
The way that I can answer that is by maybe describing how I see his family having responded.
Yeah.
So his sibling has publicly, on television and other things, been very adamant in insisting in a consistent view that Chaim would have taken. Whereas an uncle has been on television saying that this is why we need vengeance.
Right.
This is why we need to avenge the murders. We need to avenge the violence. People have to pay.
Mm-hmm. Is that what he says, or does he speak about security?
I think it's both. It's been a while since I have looked at the uncle's messaging.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is an element of vengeance, and I think there is an element of security.
Okay.
And I think those seem to, in the general broader discourse, get collapsed a little bit.
So the thing that you said to me when I asked you about your October 7th prior to this conversation is that, and you seem to be distinguishing yourself from some of your peers, you can't skip over it.
That's correct.
Tell me about that. And tell me about also what it's been like to see your contemporaries, however you would define them, skip over the brutality and the violence of October 7th.
I want to say two things about that. One is that it's appropriate and necessary to have space for expressing that grief, for expressing the pain of October 7th, the tremendous trauma that October 7th engendered, not only in Israel, but for Jews with close connections to Israel all across the world. I don't think it is a footnote, whereas I know that some of my peers or colleagues or others who have similar, maybe ideological dispositions to me otherwise say, all right, enough with that. The real issue, the only issue, is Israel's response. In many ways, I agree with that, but I'm not willing to skip over there needs to be space for acknowledging, processing, attempting to come to terms with, to seek justice for the victims of October 7th. What I'm not willing to do is to say that the atrocities of October 7th justify just any kind of response on the part of the Israeli state. So that's what I'm not in any way prepared to do. That's what I would say about that.
There's something that I want to ask you as you mentioned the Israeli state. I don't know your level of observance.
Yeah.
I don't understand your internal
Yeah.
life or your communal life,
Yeah.
but there are lots of Israels, right? There's
Yeah.
Am Yisrael, there's Eretz
Right.
Yisrael, there's
Mhm.
Medinat
Mhm.
Yisrael.
Mhm.
You can
Mhm.
probably define those better than I can. What space do any or all of those things occupy in your heart, in your internal world?
Mhm.
Can you talk about that?
This is very personal, I would say,
Okay.
for me. My family, we observe Shabbat insofar as we light candles and I say Kiddush and we have Hamotzi and we try to reflect on the meaning of Shabbat. We do Havdalah. I go, well, at least I used to go more often to synagogue on a regular basis. I like ritual observance. I grew up with that. It's familiar to me. My father was on the list for the morning minyan. So if they needed to have the quorum of 10, he wasn't there every day, but if they needed, he would come. So sometimes I went with him, we
Here's
put on
a
tefillin.
backstop. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So you put on tefillin. I learned to put on tefillin in the Sephardic way. I would say I have a certain level of observance that is part of my family practice. And I would say within that, obviously, there are many references to Yisrael, to Zion. I don't see a direct relationship between those references and the current constitution of the State of Israel, formation of the State of Israel. For me, I think it's very important to separate out the place of the land of Israel in the Jewish spiritual or historical imagination from the state of Israel. And I also think it's important to distinguish between the state of Israel and the government that is in operation right now, or the regime that is in operation right now. So there are 3 or 4 different kinds of associations that I would bring to the term Israel. And for me, I do not have any religious or spiritual relationship with the state of Israel. I mean, that's not
where you sit.
That's not where I sit. I find it hard to do that, in fact. If you think and you see, when Ben Gurion declares independence, there's this famous picture of him, and there's this big photograph. Who is the photograph of? Herzl. Maybe you've seen
I've seen this at the
picture.
Jewish Agency,
Yeah,
I think.
okay.
Yeah.
This is an idolatrous moment, in a certain sense. Why would you put this man here?
What makes you say that about it being idolatrous?
It's like putting a big icon of a human there as the symbol of Jewish self-determination, of the Jewish ideal.
Like of an eternal people.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
okay.
what do you, and Herzl of all people, I mean, maybe you've read his diaries a little bit, what was his original solution? Baptism, mass baptism. I mean, he was a hyper-assimilationist. When you have that, I'm like, this guy is there and he's the symbol. I don't know, it's hard. And then I go with that, if you permit me to free associate a little bit here, I think about the messages about Israel that I received growing up. And I would say I received 2 competing messages. One message was we need somewhere that is a sanctuary for Jews. It was never articulated as like a Jewish state, but somewhere where Jews can go.
Mm-hmm.
And the second message that I received, really from the Sephardic side of my family, were in 3 parts. First part, Israel's not a Jewish state. Why is Israel not a Jewish state? Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was the example of why Israel is not a Jewish state. Why would you make a Jewish state and have the new Hebrew city be a German town where nobody observes Shabbat or puts mezuzot on their doors and eats taref? So
Okay.
this is number 1. Number 2, the Sephardim are second-class citizens.
In Israel.
In Israel. This was a mantra First of all, Israel was not a main topic of conversation in our home, ever. But when it did come up, this was always raised immediately. The Sephardim are second-class citizens. We are not fully part of that society. And that would be linked to the third piece, which is, and the Palestinians.
This is so fascinating. People don't understand these links. Can you say anything about the second and the third? We are second class here and the Palestinians. People can't understand how that can be an utterance in a brown community. Is it okay if I frame it that way?
I don't think anybody in my family would use that kind of terminology, but I think they would in terms of an underclass,
right,
or a set of communities that would be perceived as, in different ways, oppressed or subjugated. I think there would be an acceptance of some commonality there. Herzl says Israel will be a bulwark between something to the effect of civilization and uncivilization. This is what Israel will be. The implication of that is that the Israeli society that is going to emerge will be a European society. And it will be rooted in European everything, essentially. What that does is it placed Sephardim and Mizrahim and Palestinians outside of that main thrust of what the state of Israel was going to be, if that's what it's going to be. Hatikva is a melody of a Romanian folk song. Pate Mizrach. We're going to the east.
East.
My family, Jerusalem, was east from Salonika. But if you're from Iraq, you're from Yemen, you're from Iran, you're from Central, this was created without these people in mind.
Okay, so first of all, by the time you, and again, I think we're both 43, you get to college and you find out you don't exist, right?
Right.
It's always East because these communities are make-believe. The second thing that I really want to highlight here is that I worry when I have these conversations that splices of them are going to be taken, put on the internet, somebody's going to share it. Dr. Devin Naar said XYZ, and it filters to your students, right?
Yeah.
And you are their exposure to Israel. They didn't get it in their home. They don't know Hatikva. They say Israel in public and they get a little, hush, like what am I saying? Is this the worst place in the world? What kind of responsibility do you feel like you have as the emblem of Judaism, of Israel, when you think about sharing this full commentary, knowing some of it can get drawn out and maybe make people, in fact, less connected to their Judaism or their heritage than they would have been before? Is that a fair question?
I don't know if it's a fair question, but I'll try to answer it. I mean, insofar as you're conflating things.
Yeah, okay.
In terms of Judaism and Jewishness in Israel and the state of Israel, these are different aspects that may be key pillars of one's sense of self or one's community's sense of Jewish identity, but they don't necessarily have to be that way. I'm inspired by a Sephardic philosopher, 20th century philosopher whose family was from Salonika. His family wound up in France during World War I, and he was born there. His name was Edgar Nahum. And during World War II, he took the nom de guerre Morin. So Edgar Morin is a well-known French philosopher now, and he speaks about his family's identity as Sephardim through the prism of multi-rootedness. He says, we have in our ancestry, we have Spain, and we have Portugal, and we have the Ottoman Empire, and we have the city of Salonika itself. And now we have France. We could say now we have the United States. And he thinks about Sephardic identity and maybe Jewish identity more generally through a concept he terms polyenracinement, multi-rootedness. And that is a concept that really resonates with me.
But because you experience multi-rootedness.
Because I cannot say my life is inside the Jewish frame, full stop. Both because my Jewishness is not inside of the normative Jewishness, and also because of how I am perceived on the outside world. Walking down the streets of Seattle, especially speaking Ladino, which sounds like Spanish, I mean, I've had some troubling encounters as a result of that. I've had some troubling encounters when people have perceived me as Middle Eastern or as Muslim that have put me in a defensive position. And so rather than recoil from that, say, oh, no, I'm not Middle Eastern. Oh, no, I'm not Latino. I say, well, I am connected. We are connected. I'm connected to them. I want to stand up for them. And I think Ladino as a language does that too. It is a multi-rooted language. My children speaking Ladino, or at least hearing Ladino, they're speaking it less and less the older and older that they get. And public school is terrible for that. But they understand that Ladino is a hybrid language. It's got Spanish in there. It's got Portuguese. It's got Hebrew, Turkish, Greek, Italian, French. They have one step already on their way to building some kind of connection with their neighbor.
The pivot that I made, I did it 2 weekly, and I'm going to take a step too. I don't like academia because I feel that there's a lot of critique and a lot of deconstruction.
Yes.
And not a lot of creation, generativity, right?
Okay.
What I'm saying to you is that, yeah, you have multi-rootedness. This has come up in other podcasts that you've done. Yeah. You have access to languages that many people don't have access to. You have this whole tapestry of Ashkenazi and Sephardic in your background. You've experienced Israel, clearly, in multiple ways. What is the role of the scholar, of the academic right now on a college campus for college students who do not have any rootedness, let alone multi-rootedness?
Thank you. A completely different conversation.
Is it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say I was answering from a personal perspective. This is why I'm very anxious about this conversation in a certain sense. This is not what I would say in my classroom.
What makes you anxious about this?
For some of the reasons that you alluded to, maybe some of my comments will be taken out of context or the personal piece will be imagined as my pedagogy, which it's really not. I taught a course on anti-Semitism during the encampment on our campus in the spring of 2024. And this was one of the most rewarding and challenging courses that I've ever taught because of the range of participants. I had Jewish students who were identifying as anti-Zionist, Jewish students who were identifying as Zionist, Jewish students who were wearing keffiyehs, Jewish students wearing Stars of David. My pedagogy, how do I enter a space like this, is not with abstractions like multi-rootedness, but it is through trying to cut through slogans. And this was a pedagogy that I developed. On one of the earliest classes, one of the students, we were talking about whether maybe the campus leadership would call on the authorities to take down the encampment or prosecute the participants in the encampment. And one of the students made the claim that SPD, Seattle Police, is like the Nazis. And another student looked at me like, what are you going to do? And so I interjected and I said, okay, let's hold on. Like, we're not going to make analogies to the Holocaust just like that. And I invoked Godwin's law. Do you know Godwin's law? Godwin's law is like in the early days of chats and stuff like that, says the longer an online conversation progresses, the likelihood of one person denouncing their adversary as Hitler or the Nazis approaches 1. So, I mean, eventually it will happen. I mean, we know this to be true, right? What is the purpose of that? The purpose of that is to say you are the epitome of evil, number 1, and this conversation is over. There's nothing to say after that. And so I said, okay, so we're not making the analogies to the Nazis like that. And I went home and I said, wait, did I just impose a speech code on my students? So I came back the next day and I said, you can say whatever you want in this class. Basically, we have to explain what you mean. We are going to move beyond slogans. Free Palestine. What does it mean? And actually, the students agreed to it. We're not going to just say these things in the class and expect us to understand what it means. From the river to the sea, what does it mean? Let's look at the different interpretations that are at play and the arguments that are behind them. I want you to understand why people are making these claims and what they understand those claims to be and why people are against those particular interpretations. What you think in the end, that's your business. I'm not imposing an interpretation, but I want them to understand the arguments. Other slogans include Israel is
the only democracy in the Middle East.
This is a slogan. What does democracy mean, right? What is the Middle East?
For our listeners, I don't necessarily agree that it's a slogan, but I do know that you think it's a slogan.
I think it's a slogan.
Having spoken to you about this previously.
I think it counts. And what do I mean by a slogan?
Yeah, what do you mean?
I think that it is a term that is used to signal some kind of position.
Okay.
It's an ideological kind of statement of sorts. The feedback that I got from students, remember, I had that whole range of students, overwhelmingly positive. Some of the most positive reviews I've ever gotten in my entire career. And looking at the comments, one of the themes that came through in the responses was that this was the only time that they were able to pause and consider these terms that are being flung about on social media, on the quad, in different places. I'm saying this, what does that actually mean? One of the most fascinating moments was where somehow one of the students wound up revealing that they were saying that they were a Zionist, and another said that they were an anti-Zionist. And they said, well, what do those terms mean? And what was fascinating in that moment was some of the students who said that they were Zionist, once they explained what they meant, recognized that they had more in common with people who said that they were anti-Zionist than with some of the other people who said that they were Zionist. The terms have been emptied of meaning because they are used in this polemical way. That is most pronounced in the title of the course, anti-Semitism, right? And we spent the whole time trying to parse, what does this term mean? How is the term developed in terms of its understanding? How is the term related to historical phenomena that existed that were clearly anti-Jewish, but the term anti-Semitism is a late 19th century term. So trying to understand and try to make sense out of all of this, that is what I saw as my goal in the classroom, to help my students develop a more sophisticated understanding of how to read texts and how to develop their own opinions and claims based on the evidence that we had in the classroom.
It's interesting. For me, the issue with the encampments has always been the absence of pause. When you get slogans going, it's the advertising mentality. I can't unhear it. I can't think quite clearly. I mean, you're giving me the only example that I've heard since October 7th of where the academy can be an opportunity for pause. In this particular arena, you're making a compelling case. Is there anything that you would share with your colleagues, people who are doing Jewish studies, on how to facilitate this environment against this larger backdrop?
I think what helped is early on, I acknowledged that I made a mistake.
What was the mistake?
Well, that I imposed...
Oh, that you had a speech code.
And I think that alerted the students that the class is a work in progress. It was also a low enrolling course, which was surprising. In the end, I had 10 students sign up.
Oh, this was an intimate space.
Yeah, it was an intimate space. So that was also key. It was conversation based around our readings. And it was also intergenerational, because there were some students who were retired people that sat in on the class. So you had people aged 18 to 80, essentially, in the class.
Oh, wow.
So it was so fascinating, this dynamic. And it didn't match your expectations. Like when a 78-year-old anti-Zionist Sephardic Jewish man sat next to a 19-year-old Zionist Jewish woman, and the guy was wearing a keffiyeh. This was toward the end of the class, because we built this trust. It was before class. There were no other seats taken. They sat next to each other. The younger student asked the older gentleman who was wearing the keffiyeh, both Jewish, why are you wearing keffiyeh? And he explained, and it was related to his own sense of Sephardic identity and connection to the Middle East and to the Muslim world. It's not like that younger student the next day is like, oh, great, I'm going to put on a keffiyeh.
Right.
But they recognized something that I feel is hard to grasp sometimes, is each other's humanity.
Yeah.
Like there can be a reason that you are doing things that are radically different and maybe are uncomfortable and challenging, but that doesn't mean that the other is a monster or out to get you or something like that. And I think setting it up in such a way that we could develop that conversation was really key. I was saying that before the class started, some students came to me, prospective students who were interested in the class. They asked, is this going to deal with the history of anti-Semitism or like also today? And I thought students would be interested in like also today. I don't really know, but the sense I got from them was that they didn't want to deal with the now.
Okay, so this is my other question. Do we need historians to be signing statements about political events that take place in the modern day? So there's something about students maybe intimating to you that it would be better for them, or a safer space, to keep the present out of it and give a cocoon in that way. So I ask you this respectfully, but it's a question I've had.
It's an impossibility what you're aspiring for, because there is no way to create a completely neutral space in the classroom because the framework that you bring has ideological implications and underpinnings. Like if you want to narrate, how did October 7th happen? Do you start October 7th on October 7th? Or do you start it in 1948? There's no context for October 7th. It's on one position, more of a right-wing position. There's no context in which this happened, but there is certainly a history, right? And so depending on your starting point, is it Balfour? Is it the pogroms in Eastern Europe? I'd like to look at all of these different kinds of starting points. At the end of the day, though, faculty are human beings. We are political actors. We do vote. We have conviction. We participate in the public sphere. The aspiration or the ideal of the public intellectual is a real thing. If you cannot comment drawing on your own expertise on the world as it is transpiring in front of you,
then sit at your dinner table. But I don't know if that means you have to go online.
No.
I hear what you're saying.
I mean, what I learned from 2021 is that I will not sign statements that I have not composed myself. So I want my words to be
fully your own.
My words, so that I can take complete ownership of them. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't write something or sign something or say something. I mean, I'm saying things now. Students recognize that. The expectation of complete neutrality is not a reasonable expectation or objectivity. What I want to show my students are a multiplicity of perspectives. And I want them to understand the argumentations that undergird those perspectives.
You may have said something to that effect in a podcast episode that I listened to recently. It was a Jewish Currents podcast, On the Nose.
Okay.
You or another speaker on the show might have talked about the importance of bringing in more voices to a conversation rather than trying to find the perfect articulation of the right one.
I don't know if I said that or somebody else, but that reflects sort of my approach. The polyphonic multiple voices is a key perspective, also to break out of a dichotomy. This and that, us versus them, sitting in the complexity and in the gray is a very important exercise in the classroom. It doesn't mean that you cannot ultimately take a position, but engaging with the multiplicity of positions out there is really key.
I'll say something else that I've thought about academics.
Okay.
Over the course
I see what...
Listen,
what screen you have foisted upon me here, okay?
The truth is I have a lot of academics in my life.
Yeah.
And so I speak with some, awareness of what folks have been thinking and doing and how voices are coming online and where they're held back. One thing that I've noticed among my friends who are academics is a lot of anger and a lot of frustration, and I'm sure a lot of despair since October 7th, probably because of what you're describing, this sense of what team do you root for, and I don't want to hear anything else from you. Let's boil this down. The episode that I listened to from Jewish Currents podcast On the Nose is called Mizrahi Sephardic Therapy, right? It's like a therapy episode, kind of coaching this woman, you can give us context in a moment, through her own sense of, I don't know, maybe some distress about her Sephardic Mizrahi heritage. Does she own it? Does she need to own it? What does as a Jew kind of mean to her? You're sort of in the role, you're in one of the chairs as almost a therapist, coaching her through her experience. People who listen to this podcast know that my real job is that I'm a therapist. I have found that people in the academic world seem very angry. And you don't.
I don't seem angry?
No, I mean, you seem a little angry. There's a lot to be angry about, but you seem like you're doing some work. Okay? Can you talk about the role that owning your pain has? What kind of work is necessary to bring with you into this sphere that you're in, this room that we're in?
I'm going to answer that kind of sideways, maybe.
Please, yeah.
I want to introduce another element of grief in my space.
Okay.
I spoke about Chaim Katzman. In my graduate student circle, another student was killed. Ayşenur Ayi, who is a Turkish-American student who was at the University of Washington. Her death, her murder by Israeli military forces near Nablus, where she was involved in protesting the illegal settlements in that area. She went there, and she was very, very close with some of my graduate students. And so for me, picking the side, it doesn't work because of my background and because of my academic work, which places me in contact with Jews and Muslims, with Israelis and Palestinians, who I number among my intimate circle of friends. How do you, as a faculty member, support a student whose very close friend has been killed? Whether it's Chaim's friends, whether it's Aishanor's friends. I would have benefited from some training in therapy and counseling. I was going to meet with one of my students, one of my graduate students who's in Turkey. She's doing an excellent project about women's history and Ottoman Jewish history and midwifery, the practice of abortion. Very fascinating topic. Aishanor was at her house in Istanbul. That was her last stop before going to the West Bank. Her stuff was at my student's house. I want to be in a position to support all of my students as best I can. And this is a profound trauma, the murder of a friend, in this way. She's an American citizen. The United States has not opened an investigation. How can I support the student? I cannot say it will be okay.
Right.
It's not okay. Under no circumstances is any of it okay. There is real life that intervenes here and has a tremendous psychological cost. How does this relate to my role as the therapist in the Jewish Currents podcast? The podcast was framed as therapy for Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews to come together and to think about how do we work through our own exclusion from the dominant narrative of the Jewish experience. And I think that's the wrong framing for that conversation. There needs to be an episode for Jews in general to come to terms with the exclusion of Sephardim and Mizrahim from certainly the American Jewish educational system, the Israeli educational system to a certain extent. Why has that been the case? What are the wrongs there? What is the work that we as the Jewish collective need to do to come to terms with those exclusions, the violence of those exclusions? I see a direct link between the experiences of the Sephardim and the Mizrahim and also the Palestinians. I mean, I alluded to that before. And I think that's something that is uncomfortable, but it needs to be addressed. And I don't feel like it's being addressed because the figure of the Sephardic Jew or the Mizrahi Jew has become a football.
You said football.
Yeah, a football. We can hold up the Sephardic Jew or the Mizrahi Jew as a symbol of the persecution that Jews have always experienced in Muslim lands. They were expelled. They were persecuted. They were dispossessed. This is a right-wing argument. I'm characterizing these arguments. And the left-wing argument might be Sephardic Jews lived in peace with their neighbors, and everybody was together. And then Zionism came in and disrupted the whole scenario and provoked the cataclysm of the flight of Jews from Muslim world. I think there are kernels of each of these pieces of the story, but I don't think either of them really try to understand the range of experiences of what we call Sephardim and Mizrahim in their complexity. When I was having conversations with members in the Sephardic community after the 2021 statement, I always like to ask people, well, who is their favorite Zionist Sephardic thinker?
Are you trying to trick them?
I'm not trying to trick them. I'm trying to see whether they have thought about the question. Because they come with the strong sense of Sephardic identity, that they're defending Sephardic identity and that I'm undercutting it in some way.
But this feels like a booby trap, this question. I don't even know the answer one way or the other, but I sense a trap.
I'm curious the extent to which they are familiar with their own history.
Yeah.
The answer was almost invariably, I don't know. Judah Halevi, okay, that was 1,000 years ago. And maybe they can reference Rav Uziel, who was the first Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel. Everybody knows about Rav Kook. He was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. People think he was the first chief rabbi. He was the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. There's also a Sephardic chief rabbi. I'm saying this to demonstrate the extent to which the erasure has been internalized, the damage that has done. And I think there's a reason for that erasure, because if you recuperate the perspectives of the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in the late 19th century into the 20th century, including into the middle of the 20th century, the narratives begin to unwind a little bit. When you are talking about Jews in the Ottoman Empire, let's say, you are talking about a place in which Palestine, Israel, was an integral part. The possibility of Zionism, the starting point is completely different than it is when you're talking about it from the Eastern European or Western European perspective. From Salonika to Jerusalem is one country until just before World War I. So the attitudes that Sephardic Jews expressed, and I'm talking about the leadership, I'm talking about the chief rabbi of the Ottoman Empire. It's very, very different when you're talking about a place in your own country and people are telling you from the outside that this part of your own country, the Ottoman Empire, should be taken out of the Ottoman Empire and transformed into something else. Sephardic Jewish leadership was not on board with that.
Something interesting is happening.
Okay.
I asked you how you keep some of the anger at bay, but I think you got angry.
Did I get angry?
I think you got a little angry. I mean, I hear in this question of who is your favorite Zionist Sephardic thinker, something in that feels a little hostile because the point is there's not many to choose from, if at all.
That is absolutely false. That's my point. There are many, 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 many figures nobody knows about.
But they don't know
They
them.
don't know about them. Do you know about Yosef Kastel? Do you know about Ben Kiki? Do you know about Yosef Uziel? Do you know about Rekanat? I mean, I can go on a list and list.
But there is a little something.
Yes,
in
what
that.
I'm trying to do is puncture a myth. You think you know your history.
Okay, you and I had a conversation. You've already talked about this today. You've talked about times when you felt unsafe in your body, corresponding to people thinking that you are Latino because they think you're speaking Spanish, or that you were of Middle Eastern / Muslim heritage. And then when we spoke prior to this conversation, you said that you did an experiment where you wore, I think for only 45 minutes, a kippah out in public, and you felt like, you never sweat so much because you kind of had a target on your back.
How did we just get
I'm going
there?
to tell you.
Yeah,
I'm going to
okay,
tell you.
Okay.
The conversations that we had with people in Europe for the third season of the podcast reflect some of what I'm hearing in terms of the conversations that you have with people here, the Sephardic community, their attitudes about Israel. A young man said to us, first of all, that any conversation that's critical of Israel needs to be internal. But his follow-up statement was, Israel is our life insurance. The people you're talking about right now feel that, don't they?
Several articles in the forward have talked about how Israel has been the least safe place for Jews to live since 1948.
People sometimes describe a psychological safety.
Okay. A psychological safety is different than a bodily safety,
Sure.
in a certain sense, right? So I would distinguish between those two. I'm eligible for 6 nationalities. Israel is one. I have only one right now. Maybe one day I will have others.
You're American.
I'm an American citizen. That's right. I don't think about it that way. And I think that has to do with some of the dynamics that I described. My parents have never been to Israel. I went only as an adult for my studies, where I experienced quite a bit of anxiety at the airport. Naar, so you're Arab. And I made the mistake of saying no. In the depths of myself, the answer is, so what? So I got interrogated. I'm going to this place that they tell me is my homeland or whatever. And now I'm getting not the regular interrogation. Everybody gets the regular interrogation. This was extra interrogation. And it was fascinating because why did this guy think I'm an Arab? Because he knew Arabic. And Nar is in the Quran. Wadi Nar is the path to brimstone, essentially. Nar is like fire in Arabic. So we're talking. I'm telling him, oh, you want to know about my genealogy? And as a matter of fact, in 1492, and I gave him the, the whole thing. At the end of the day, he's like, well, I'm Sephardic also. My family's from Iraq. It was like there was a sense of coming together, but it was interesting how he, as a Mizrahi person, as someone of Arabic-speaking roots, is now the guardian against the prospect of an Arab entering the Jewish state. He's being a pawn, essentially.
Do you think he feels that way?
I don't think he feels that way. He thinks he's being patriotic. But he is doing the work of creating that rampart between the East and the West.
Right.
He is doing that ideological work. I can go to a place that nobody in my direct line that I know of has lived in or set foot in for many, 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 many years. My Palestinian friends cannot do that. They cannot go to the place their grandparents were from, or their parents even. That makes me feel palpably the injustice of the whole scenario in myself.
Are you ever at peace? Do you ever feel peaceful?
I don't know the answer to that question. I feel tremendous discomfort, tremendous shame is an overriding emotion that I feel right now for what the state of Israel is doing allegedly in my name. That is not conducive to a peaceful state of mind. I am incredibly distraught by it. I feel tremendous shame interacting with my Palestinian friends. They don't impute that upon me. I feel it. I have people close to me who want to resign from the Jewish people. They tell me this. How did Zionism substitute for Judaism? How did the state of Israel become Jewishness? How is there no way for me to express a Jewish identity outside of that space? This is what people close to me are saying, and I don't have that problem in the same way. I mean, it's Elul, right? I have Selichot. I go to 4 different synagogues sometimes. I like certain things at different ones, but nowhere is mine. So what do I do with my kids? Selichot is the car ride to school every morning.
Do you say Selichot in the car?
Yeah, I play for them recordings of the Sephardic Selichot, and we sing along. This is my Selichot. We blow shofar together. We practice shofar. I'll blow shofar. So, these are some of the ways that I try to make sense and try to, in some ways, rescue my Jewish identity in this moment.
I feel like this conversation is unfinished, and yet it's been quite some time.
It has.
Devin, thank you so much for taking the time. It means a great deal to me and hopefully to our listeners.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.
Mosquitava na ire